Okay, so the event handler is going to retrieve values from the various text boxes and checkboxes and display the result on the yellow label. If you want to interact with controls in your web application, the easiest way to do it is to select each HTML control and invoke the Run as Server Control option. Now, that's added a little green arrow to the control, as you can see at the top there. And if we go down to the source view, it's added a run at equals server property to the control. I'm going to do that for each of the controls, and then we'll talk about what's actually happening. So for the age control, for that text box, let's say run as server control. For the label, let's right click and say run as server control. For the select, let's right click and say run as server control. And then for each of the checkboxes, I'll select all the checkboxes and I'm going to run them all as server controls. And then finally, let's not forget the button itself. Right click the button and run as server control. So what's the purpose of doing that? What that means is when we submit the data to the ASP.NET web server, each item that's specified as run at equals server will be represented by a .NET object in my server application, which will expose the data and enable me to interact with the object in an easier way than using traditional ASP processing techniques. Hopefully all of this will become clear in a moment when we actually implement the event handler for the submit button. So let's click on the submit button again and come down to the properties window and set the event. You'll notice there is no event button here. When we looked at how to do this with web controls in lesson 1, there was a little lightning bolt here which specified the various different events you could handle on that control. Unfortunately, when you're using HTML controls, such as submit buttons and input text boxes, you don't get any events displayed in the property window. What you have to do, you probably guessed this by now, is go into the source view and manually add the event handling attribute yourself. So I'm going to locate the submit button. Here it is. There are two types of server event that you can handle for HTML controls. One is server click and the other is server change. So for a button, we need to handle the on server click event, and you need to give it the name of a method in the code behind class which will handle that event. So I'm going to choose the name my submit handler, and I'm going to implement that method in a moment. So let's go to the code behind class, and here we're going to have to manually add an event handler called my submit handler, and you have to be quite accurate here. So the method is going to be protected and it has no return value, so void. We said the name of the method was my submit handler. The arguments for the method must be exactly as I'm going to type here. So the first parameter is an object, and that represents the sender or the control that generated the event, in other words the button. And the second parameter must be an event args, and I'll call that parameter args. And in this method I'm going to implement my event handler logic for the submit button. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to retrieve the user's name. So I'm going to declare a string variable called name, and I'm going to retrieve the value from the name text box. So name text box is an object which is available to my code at the server, and it's available because in my ASPX page, when we specified the text box, we indicated that the text box is run at server. And because of this run at server, that tells ASP.NET that when the web application runs, it should create an object with the same name text box, and make that object available to us in our code. So this here is present purely because of the run at equals server attribute. And that's a very important point for you to understand. Okay, so that's the person's name. Let's also get the person's age. And what we'll do next is we'll get the person's nationality. So string nationality equals... Now, if you remember, the select control was called nationality list. Nationality list is an instance of a class called HTML select, and it has a property called items, which is a collection of all the items in that selection list box. And if you want to get the selected item, you have to index into that collection by using the square brackets operator. And the index you specify is numeric. So you somehow have to deduce which is the currently selected index in the list. So the way you do that is like this. Nationality list dot selected index. So that gives us the currently selected item in the select box, and we're just going to get the value of that item. Very good.